South African lawyers have written to President Joe Biden warning that they intend to begin proceedings against the United States based on evidence that the United States government is, quote, providing material assistance and means to Israel as the Palestinian people are, quote, affected by the ongoing international crimes and displacement perpetuated by the Israeli government and its armed forces. After yesterday's hearing on Israel's actions in Gaza, the South African delegation has rejected Israel's argument that it is acting in self-defense.
Self-defense is no answer to genocide. Nothing can ever justify genocide. There is no balancing exercise as Israel has sought to suggest. The prohibition is absolute. No matter what some individual within the group of Palestine in Gaza may have done, and no matter how great the threat to Israel's citizens might be, genocidal attacks on the whole of Gaza and the whole of its population with the intent of destroying them cannot be justified at all.
The Gray Zone's Max Blumenthal asked the State Department how it could dismiss evidence of, quote, on-the-record statements from Israeli leadership expressing to commit genocide on Palestine.
How can you explain this discrepancy between Secretary Blinken accusing China explicitly of genocide with no mass killing, presenting no evidence of the mass killing of Uyghurs, and then dismissing out of hand the potential that Israel could be committing genocide in the Gaza Strip, calling it unfounded? How do you explain this discrepancy?
The same way that I just explained it to your colleague who asked essentially the same version of your question, which is that each conflict is different, and any kind of determination like this needs to be based on specific facts and law. And when it comes to the points that are being made in today's hearing, again, I'm not going to speak to those specifically. Israel will have an opportunity to address some of those tomorrow. But we again feel that these allegations that Israel is committing genocide are unfounded. That being said, we do not disagree that additional steps must and need to be taken to minimize the impact on civilians, and we'll continue to raise that directly with relevant partners.
Max Blumenthal also asked about Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visits to Israel.
The Secretary Blinken, who went to Israel first, declaring he was there as a Jew, identifying with the ethno-religious character of this state, which is now standing accused of the potential to commit genocide. Is Secretary Blinken concerned that ruling in favor of South Africa in this case could set the stage for his own prosecution or that of your colleagues?
I'm just not going to get ahead of hypotheticals, and you probably shouldn't either.
Speaking of Blinken, he will be featured on the cover of Time magazine this month under the title of The Envoy, Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the Test of American Leadership, where he weighs in on the war in Gaza and how it is, quote, a test of U.S. power. Joining us now to discuss is editor-at-large at The Intercept, Jeremy Scahill. Jeremy, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
So let's start with South Africa going after the United States for providing arms to Israel. How did South Africa make the determination to get involved in this, and what is their particular interest?
Well, first of all, any nation that's a party to the Genocide Convention and accepts the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, the World Court, can bring these charges because all nation states have an obligation to prevent genocide. And so on a purely technical level, South Africa is saying that they're recognizing that there's the potential that Israel is committing genocide with its operations in Gaza, and that it's doing its duty as a responsible member state and a signatory to the Genocide Convention. But in a more political and historical aspect, if we're to look at that, South Africa suffered for many decades under an apartheid system that its own government compares to the conditions that Palestinians are living under in Gaza and in the West Bank. And so I think there was a great deal of political significance. Nelson Mandela himself, when he finally was freed, it's important to remember that he was on the U.S. terrorism watch list until the 1990s and was characterized, Mandela, as a terrorist by the United States government. We should just put that fact on the table. But Mandela himself, when he did interviews in the United States on his first visit after he was freed, there was an effort to try to get him to condemn the Palestinian Liberation Organization and Yasser Arafat. And Mandela was crystal clear that he is not going to allow the United States to tell South Africa who its enemies are, and in fact said that South South Africa appreciated the solidarity shown by the Palestinian people. So there's a kind of epic historical significance to this, but on a purely technical or legal matter, many more states probably should have been involved with this much earlier on. South Africa now is doing what I think many nations, even if they won't say it out loud, believe is the proper course of pursuing Israel's completely indiscriminate bombing of Gaza.
And a quick follow-up, if I may, if you don't mind, Jessica, I wanted to ask about Senator John Fetterman's comments. He pointed out that he believes that there is a genocide happening against white farmers in South Africa, which would diminish their credibility to speak out on this issue. He's, of course, referring to the fact that there have been thousands of farmers subject to murder and rape and torture in South Africa over the past decade. Farmers are reportedly 2 to 3 times more likely to be murdered than the average South African citizen. Do you think that there is a genocide happening in South Africa against farmers and white farmers more specifically? And does Senator Fetterman's criticism hold any weight?
Senator John Fetterman has shown a shocking and callous lack of soul when he has discussed what is happening now to the Palestinian people of Gaza. I wouldn't take his word more seriously than a guy working at a random bodega in the United States when it comes to morality and terms like genocide. He's already proven himself to be a complete stooge for Israel's lie-filled narrative about the war on Gaza. And, this is part of the Hasbara campaign that Israel has been waging to try to shift the focus onto internal politics and policies within South Africa. Certainly, South Africa should be scrutinized, just like all governments should, for its treatment of all of its citizens or any crimes that it may be committing. But the idea that bears any relevance to the 84-page indictment that South Africa has issued, that was written by a team of international lawyers, including those from Britain and the United Kingdom and elsewhere, this is a ludicrous attempt to distract from an ongoing genocide that the Irish lawyer for South Africa said in court is the first genocide where people are filming their own destruction in the desperate hope that someone somewhere in the world is going to do something about it. So I'm not going to play this game where now all of a sudden we start talking about South Africa. These are very serious charges. It was a meticulously documented indictment of Israel's policy in Gaza. And I think John Fetterman should be ashamed of himself for the way that he's conducted himself on both a political and moral level in this crisis.
I couldn't agree with that more. As someone who's, spent 6 months of my life living in South Africa, the statements about Afrikaans white farmers being attacked are extremely overblown. It's rhetoric that comes from white supremacists still living in South Africa. And, giving land back has been a policy that was the initial plan of the ANC and Nelson Mandela. That's really been difficult because of the strongholds on power that still Afrikaans people have in South Africa today. So John Fetterman, I don't know if he's ever spent time in South Africa. We know he's gone on trips to Israel. But I think what we really need to focus on here is the case being made against Israel. It's a very solid one. Now, the lawyer for South Africa said in yesterday's hearing that we really haven't also had a genocide where you have the perpetrator openly admitting to having genocidal intent, saying things like the people living in Gaza are human animals and that there is no one who is innocent in Gaza, and using this as a reason to kill civilians, over 23,000 at this point, many of them being children. And so we're in this situation now where Israel is seemingly taking this approach of denying their history of violence in Palestine, but also saying that their words were misinterpreted when pretty objectively it's hard to misinterpret those words. I wonder what you make of their current defense and how it holds up against the initial arguments, Jeremy.
I mean, basically, and I was reporting on the hearings all day today and Israel's rebuttal case. And basically, Israel's defense, if you can call it that, boiled down to a few basic assertions that history did not begin 75 years ago with the Nakba. History, you have no right to raise any history of the context in which the people of Gaza were living on October 6th, that history actually began on October 7th, that South Africa is effectively the legal arm or legal entity of Hamas, that South Africa itself should be brought up on charges for failing to prevent Hamas from committing genocide, that October 7th is the real genocide, and that everything that has happened to the upwards of 30,000 Palestinians that have been killed and tens of thousands that have been maimed is all lawful under international law, and that the Israeli Defense Forces are the most moral armed force to ever exist in the history of humanity. That was essentially the defense that Israel offered. While they did make some technical legal arguments to try to assert that because Israel has done X, Y, and Z, this means that it's not genocide, much of the thrust of the legal argument that Israel was putting forward today had to do with procedural issues. They spent a lot of time saying South Africa didn't properly give Israel a right to respond individually to South Africa on a state-to-state level, and therefore the case should be dismissed. They also said, they discombobulated two of their requests for provisional measures to be issued by the court. Therefore, this wasn't filed properly and it should be dismissed. Israel also, I think the most ludicrous part of Israel's defense is when not one, but 2 to 3 lawyers from Israel implied that all of these openly genocidal statements that were made by Netanyahu, by Defense Minister Gallant, by President Herzog, that are very clearly expressing genocidal intent, that these were just random cherry-picked statements that the lawyers for South Africa had put into court. And then one of the lawyers said that the South Africans basically don't understand theology and that they had misinterpreted Benjamin Netanyahu's invocation of the tale of Amalek, where God orders the Israelites to massacre all of the women, children, men, and cattle. I would say it's shocking, except it's not, because what we've seen is a systematic lie machine operating out of Tel Aviv that has been promoted, co-signed, and doubled down on by Antony Blinken, by a U.S. official who's apparently serving as a dual-hatted spokesperson for the United States and Israeli governments, Admiral John Kirby of the National Security Council. No lie is too outrageous that the Israeli government is telling for the United States to repeat it and co-sign it. So, this wasn't much of a defense, but I will say, I think Israel is being smart to focus in on procedural issues because they don't have a really good answer to the charge of genocide. So I think the best hope for Israel in this is that the judges are going to sympathize with Israel's more technical arguments and dismiss this on procedural grounds.
Yeah,
I'd just like to really quickly
Go ahead,
follow
Jessica.
up. We've had, cases brought before the International Court of Justice in the past, the United States versus Nicaragua, where, the United States was found guilty of committing atrocities by backing the Contras in the Sandinista-Contra war in Nicaragua. Now, a lot of people say that the United States is not going to be found guilty of this and have any serious consequences. I mean, my view is that the most serious consequences will be that evidence of genocide will be there for everyone to see on the global stage, evidence that's not always covered by mainstream media. Of course, we had many people complaining that there wasn't coverage on CNN and BBC of South Africa's case, but they were streaming Israel's defense. I'm curious what you think the outcome of this case will be.
I'm glad that you brought up the case from the 1980s where the United States was convicted of terrorism for mining the harbors around Nicaragua. In fact, the current president of the tribunal that is hearing this current genocide case, Joan Donahue, is an American. She's the president of the tribunal, and she was one of the legal advisors to the American defense in that case that you're mentioning about Nicaragua. She also was very close to Hillary Clinton. So that, I'm not accusing her of not being an impartial judge in this, but it's an important fact to note that the Americans are right now in control of the presidency of the International Court of Justice that is hearing this case. At the end of the day, I think the most significant thing that could come out of a ruling in favor of South Africa is that it's going to really call the question on the United States allies in Europe of whether they actually support a system of international law and international jurisprudence. Because if you have a ruling where the court orders Israel provisionally to halt its military operations and Israel defies that order, then what are Germany, France, all of these other countries of the European Union that are American allies, what are they going to say? Because, we're accustomed in the United States to living where the emperor of the world, whoever the president is, dictates which countries actually have to follow international law. Most of the world's governments are not viewed that way. They actually take it seriously when, with the exception of Russia, China, powerful nations. But in the European Union, it's going to be taken seriously. So I think perhaps the most significant thing beyond the obvious, which is what you're stating, these were all heard, charges of genocide in an open court that technically does have jurisdiction over all countries in the world. But on a more practical level, it's going to put a lot of pressure on America's allies to answer the question of if they think the United States is in charge of the world or international law is.
All right, Jeremy, thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate you joining us this morning on Rising.
Good to be with both of you.